Do you remember back in January I released this video where I talked you through the making of the Halston skirt? The very lovely Maggie sent me this amazing pattern. Ooh, good year ago, maybe 2 years ago now, probably 2 years ago now. Whilst I really like the cape, the skirt is definitely the thing that intrigued me because those pattern pieces look absolutely crazy and they are the same front and back. The thing that made the pattern work was cleverly placed notches with numbers on them. The numbers were different on the two different pattern pieces, which is why there were two rather than just cut two of this particular pattern piece. When you added the notches, or when you matched the notches up, you ended up with this really interesting kind of detail where the panels wrapped around the body, and I loved how that looked. However, that pattern was way too small for my hips, and I did fudge and try and make it work for me, but I don't think I did a very good job because I was not successful. I made a really nice skirt, but it was way too big for me at the waist, and I probably would have had to go and take the waistband out, add darts in because of the way it was finished. A couple of months later, I decided to start working on my slopers, and this skirt block was one of them. It's taken me until November, but I have plucked up the courage to give this a try. This is how it went. This is what the Halston pattern looks like, and it is a crazy pattern, but when you look at it, this is the waistline and these are the centre front and centre back seams if you follow the pattern the way that it's meant to be worn. Personally, I use these as side seams because I just thought that looked way better. And if you take off that crazy extra piece there, it's actually just an A-line skirt that has been chopped about and manipulated to give interesting style lines. My problem with the last one is that this was not big enough for me around the hips, and it was ended up way too big for me around the waist. I played around with it, but I am not great at pattern manipulation or altering patterns to fit me, as we have clearly found out. This year I have made my slopers, so I'm going to use these to make myself the bases, A-line skirt bases, which technically should fit me really well because this is a pegged pencil skirt sloper that I've got here. I'm going to swing the darts out of this so that the fullness goes, because the fullness to fit over the hips is corralled this way. If I close this dart and swing it out that way, it will give me an A-line skirt. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to follow Bianca from The Closet Historian. She explains this probably way better than I do. But that's what I am going to try and do, is get the top part, so this part of the pattern, made with my block so that it fits me, and then I'm going to try and smoosh it onto the pattern pieces that I've already created from the last time I attempted this, because I'm not overly sure what kind of sorcery is going on to get this angle or this curve like this. So I think smooshing is a technical term, obviously, but I think smooshing the top part to the bottom part of my existing patterns already is going to work really well. The other change that I'm going to make is I'm actually going to put in a centre back zip, I think, although that does mean that that centre back zip is going to be on the bias, or that centre back seam is going to be on the bias, but I want to be able to French seam these right angle seams because I really don't like the usual finish that you do at these seams. So by adding in what is going to be a centre back seam, I'll be able to put the zip in here and bias bind the edges of these seams here. Theoretically, I would sew that first, finish all that off, and then sew the skirt together the way that they wanted me to, and then yeah, in my head this works. In my head this works. Hopefully I'm explaining myself well. Probably not, but we shall see. So the first thing I need to do is take a tracing of the top half of my skirt blocks so that I have the full mirrored top half of the skirt blocks, and then I can start trying to smoosh it onto this. That is the plan. Let's see if this works.
Spoiler alert, that didn't work. I genuinely thought it was a good idea though, so I thought I would go ahead and try it out. So I chased out the top 10 inches or so of my pencil skirt blocks, and I mirrored both of those because I knew I would need to be working with the full pattern piece because nothing was going to get cut on the fold. Once I traced it out, I got the original pattern piece out, laid it on top, and realised that smooshing was just really not going to work. It was like one of those things where it's like, they are wildly different. One of my problems was that the side seams of the pencil skirt block that I had turned into an A-line were not straight, and yeah, it didn't occur to me to just straighten those out. The next thing that occurred to me was to get out my half circle skirt pattern and trace off the top 10 inches of that and see if I could smoosh that onto the original Halston pattern. So once I had the top of the half circle skirt pattern traced out, I laid it on top of the original Halston skirt pattern and realised that that wasn't going to work either. I tried it a different couple of ways. I tried doing some calculations. I thought about doing a quarter circle skirt and drafting that from scratch. I laid the original half circle skirt pattern on top of it, tried taping paper onto it, and realised that if I went down this route I was going to end up with a ginormous skirt to the point where I didn't think the pattern piece would actually fit on 150 wide centimetre fabric. I knew I had to go back to the drawing board.
Smooshing was the worst idea I ever had. I should have just drafted it from scratch, so that's what I did next, and that was not without its problems and a lot of guesswork, but I'm going to show you roughly now what I did and how I did it. So I started off with my pencil skirt sloper, and I literally traced out the centre part of the sloper and up to the first dart, and then I put a pen into the point of the dart and swiveled the top of the dart until it reached the place that I'd left off, carried on tracing out the rest of the skirt. So I ended up with something that looked like this. I rounded it out a little bit, and then I repeated that on the other side because we need to be dealing with the it's, you know, we're not cutting anything on the fold for this skirt. We are cutting out whole pattern pieces, as it were, because they are going to end up not being mirrored. I'm going to go and get better pen retrieved. Okay, so my first problem was that the side seams of the traced skirt were curved, and basically the side seams of the inspiration skirt are straight. It didn't occur to me for the longest time, longer than I care to admit, but eventually I worked out that, oh yeah, I can just straighten those out because there is more than enough room for my hips in this, what is basically an A-line skirt. It would help if I got a pen that worked. I just straightened out those side seams. Now I did have a pattern to reference to start with, obviously, and so I went and I measured how long this portion of the pattern was, and it was 10 inches from waist to basically just below my hips was 10 inches. So I went round and I did measure it out, but I went round and I drew in 10 inches the whole way around my skirt. I then put in my seam allowance because my pattern has my seam allowance included in it. My seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, just what I'm used to working with from working with big 4 patterns so frequently. So that was the start of my skirt. Then I needed to work out how long I wanted my skirt to be, and I knew I wanted it to be 31 inches in total. So if that's 10 inches, this will be, let's say, 31. So I basically just drew an A-line skirt, and again I measured all the way around so that I had an even A-line skirt, which is basically what that portion of the skirt is, as I showed you at the beginning of my attempts at smooshing. So the next thing that I needed to do was to work out how they added on this side panel. So I did actually trace out these pieces from the pattern. So this is basically the back of the pattern envelope. I've scaled it up and I traced it out because I wanted to play around with these pieces. And my theory for making this skirt work was that they actually did what I've done here, and then they added on to this side first and then put this style line in and stuck it over on this side. I don't know if that's actually how it happened, but it is in my head how that works. I have my original 2 pieces here, and I cut this one apart so that I ended up with what I thought was the starting point of my pattern. So I can just fold that piece out of the way. We'll pretend that doesn't exist. And that side piece goes on to the original A-line skirt like that, and then you get this extra winged piece coming out from that 10-inch part there. So that's the bit that I needed to work out how to do next. So I kind of just eyeballed it, and I kind of went like that and drew a line that kind of looked like the original. And then I needed to put in this hem piece here, or the curve of the hem. What I did was I measured from there, and then I just kind of carried on that hem measurement the whole way around, thinking that's probably what they did, right? That's probably how they ended up with this kind of a look. So once I'd gotten to this point, I then needed to cut it apart so that we'd end up with the interesting style lines. My brain looked at this, saw A-line skirt with thing put on two sides, with then interesting seam line put across the original skirt. So I followed along with them, and again we've got our seam allowances in here. I'd like to draw my seam allowances in, that just helps for reference points. So once I'd done that, I then added in the cut line from the pattern piece. So I'm going to chop this off, and I'm going to stick it to the second pattern piece. So far we've only been drafting with one pattern piece. This is pattern piece number 1, but we need 2 of them. And we need 2 because they do have different numbers on the notches, which is why the original skirt worked so well and why there were 2 separate pattern pieces. Even though they were exactly the same shape, they had different numbers on the notches, so that you could work out how they went back together. So what I did was I traced this one off, so I ended up with 2 of my own. Then I started cutting it apart. Okay, so this is piece number 2, and I can't write that upside down, but it's basically a cleaner copy of this one. So we're going to put piece 2 on that. So I'm going to chop these apart, and then we'll come back and start trying to play around with putting them back together in the way that they'll end up looking like the original pattern piece. Okay, so now I have 2 identical pattern pieces. We need to chop them along the interesting style line and move this piece from this pattern piece to this pattern piece, and this piece to this pattern piece. In my head this makes sense, and I think this is how they did it, but again, I am no expert, so I don't know. Whenever you cut things apart, you need to remember that you need to add seam allowance in here. I'm not going to do it in miniature, but you need to just pretend that I've cut this apart, so I've immediately gone back in and then added seam allowance to those places. And then this is part number 2, and this is part number 1. So again, I'm going to do the same thing with part 1. We are cutting along there. I'm going to pretend that I've added seam allowance into both of those lines, because when you cut something apart, you need to be able to add seam allowance back to it. So we've got part 1 and part 2. So this piece goes onto here, and this piece goes onto here. The thing that you need to remember is you've got seam allowance in this piece, so you need to take that off. And we've got seam allowance all the way down here and all the way down here. So we're overlapping those seam allowances so that the actual stitching line is matching up, and going to stick that down. And then the other thing that you want to bear in mind is that you want this to be the same measurement as that. That needs to be 10 inches, this needs to be 10 inches. I'm going to do the same for this one, and again we are overlapping the stitching, the seam allowances, so that we are matching up the stitching line. And that's another reason I include my seam allowances, just so that if I do start sticking things back together, they work out well for me. So now we have the 2 pattern pieces that theoretically you should be able to sew this piece into here, as it were. So that bit goes to that bit, and this bit goes to this bit, and then vice versa. This bit goes to this bit, and this bit goes to this bit. So the other change that I wanted to make, and the grain line for both of these pattern pieces was the same as the interesting style line. So this also helps with obviously cutting things on grain, You could totally cut them that way, but it also helps if you're using something like a stripe or a fabric with a nap. It will give you, again, interesting appearance of fabric once the skirt is sewn together with those grain lines. And it is the grain lines the original pattern had. So as you can see, I'm mirroring what the original pattern was doing. So the original pattern, this was actually the centre front and this was actually the centre back seam, which meant that you had all this extra volume coming literally from your crotch and your butt, which I didn't overly like. I didn't like this skirt when I first put it on. When I switched it so that it was a side zipper, because I did put a zip in here, I actually loved how it looked. So I wanted to have the ability to flat fell or French seam, depending on the fabric I was using, these right angle seams. And to do that, it meant that I needed to not be having to put a zip into this seam here. So I decided to add a centre back seam, which is literally the centre back seam. So this was the centre front seam of our original pencil skirt, if you remember, and I've done exactly the same for the back. So what I did was cut down that piece and then again pretend that I've stuck on paper and added seam allowance in, but I've added seam allowance into both of those places. So what was a one-piece pattern then became a two-piece pattern, it then became a three-piece pattern, and then the waistband, so 4 pieces in total. So once I'd got all that worked out, the other thing that I was not 100% sure of is if this was going to end up with a level hem. So one of the things that I did to kind of try and combat that was I drafted my skirt to be 31 inches long, thinking that I like skirts from 28 to 32 inches long. I think I talk about this in the wrap-up. My theory was that if this wasn't even, then I would be able to put it on and hem it so that it was even, and then take the pieces that I had cut off of the hem, apply them to the pattern so that the pattern would then be even. As luck would have it, it turned out completely even using that method of measuring how long the piece was and then just continuing that measurement the whole way around. I was surprised that worked, but it did. I'm very happy with how this skirt came out. The only thing I want to change is the seam allowance on this seam that I've added here, because one of the turnbacks has ended up with a slight raw edge. Let me show you. It is a really minor point, but the seam allowance on this piece here, so that is the piece with the extension on it, so the larger of the back pieces, that seam allowance there isn't the correct shape. I need to alter this so that the seam allowance will carry on and then get caught in the flat felled seam. Honestly, for this one, it's the only thing that I'm not happy about, and it's a really easy fix. So let me show you how I'm going to do that. The centre back seam here, this piece here, when you fold the seam allowance back, as you can see, it does what it did in the skirt. So I need to add a little bit of paper here, fold it back and then cut it in the correct way so that I end up with the seam allowance being caught into the seam of the skirt when it's finished. So I'm going to tape on a little bit of excess paper like that. Then I'm going to carry on that centre back line like that, and I can cut that excess piece off. Now I have some scrap paper to play with. So the next thing I'm going to do is fold back my seam allowance on itself, and then I want to cut following this straight line here, and I'm gonna do it from an angle that works for me but might not be in shot for you. There we go. So yeah, I'm gonna cut along that straight line there. So you can see now when the seam allowance is pressed back on itself, it's going to be enclosed in what will be a flat felled seam. When you open it up, you end up with a really weird little jog in your pattern, but you really do want to cut that out and have that extra piece of fabric that you then bind that edge of, because as I've said, when you fold it back, it will now get caught into the French seam or the flat fell seam, depending on which fabric you're using and what technique you want to finish your skirt with. That is how you just adjust that little back piece. That's the only thing I want to change from this skirt. I love everything else about it.
For my wearable muslin, I decided to use this stretch denim that I got from the Lady McElroy remnant sale in January 2023. It is a very similar colour to the corduroy that I used in the original Halston skirt, and that was an intentional decision. The original skirt has since been donated because it did fit me so poorly. As you can see here, this pattern piece is very wide and almost takes up the full 150 centimetre wide expanse of the fabric. I definitely think that the pattern pieces would have ended up way too big if I had gone down the half circle skirt route, so I'm glad that I abandoned that choice. Each pattern piece of the 4 that are included needed to be cut out once on a single layer of fabric. My cutting table is just over 150 centimetres square, and it is also on wheels, which makes something like this very, very easy. I decided to use a straight rectangular waistband for this skirt, and I decided to use just the one and fold it over for a clean finish. I also cut the waistband out of interfacing, and I used a coat weight interfacing for a little bit more structure. Once I'd cut everything out, I put all the excess fabric away because I think there's more than enough for a waistcoat, which is a project that I will be working on soon, drafting my own from scratch. At least that's what I'm hoping to do. Watch this space.
As you know, I have split what will be the back panel in 2 so that it has a centre back seam. I have to sew that first so that I can have this one be completely intact, so that this seam can then get sewn to this long seam here. So I need to finish the edges of this one with bias binding and put in my zip so that that piece is one piece that can then be sewn to that. So that's what I'm going to do first, is finish off the centre back seam and put in a zipper. Okay, so I've got my centre back zip in and my centre back seams finished. So the next thing that I need to do is reinforce this corner here with stitching in the corner. I'm going to do that for the same for the back and the front. Then I can clip into it, and then I can start pinning the front and back pieces together. Fingers crossed this works. Wish me luck.
When sewing a seam like this or reinforcing a corner like this, I do like to mark in the seam allowance and the pivot point just to make sure that I'm getting things nice and accurate. Once that pivot point has been reinforced with a line of stitching, I will then clip to the pivot point, opening up the seam allowance, and then pin the skirt panels or the seams together. I do have a whole video about sewing seams like this, and I demonstrate it using calico and close-up stitching. So if you want to see how that's done in a bit more detail with contrast thread and fabric, I will link to that video in the description box and also the iCards.
Everything went together as it was meant to, and it fits nicely. It's maybe a touch too big, but this is stretch denim, and I have interfaced the waistband with coat weight interfacing, so it's slightly heavier, which has meant that this now has no stretch. So I'm thinking it's actually going to be a good thing. The next thing that I need to do is finish off the seam allowances, because last time I actually bound them like I have done this centre back seam, but I didn't like the finish that I could get around these corners with that, so that's why I've added in the centre back seam, and this time I'm going to flat felt them. So I pressed them open, then I've trimmed one edge, and I've then pressed the big seam allowance over that edge, and I'm going to fold the raw edge in. It's going to be fiddly, but I will do it. I'm going to fold the raw edge in and top stitch it down. This is a denim skirt, so I quite like the look of top stitching on denim, so I'm going to get that done for both side seams. Then I can put the waistband on, and then I can check the hem, which I actually do think is level, and I'm kind of amazed. But yeah, I need to flat felt these seams first, and that also means that I'm going to be able to finish the corner points nicely with no raw edges showing, which is great. I think I'm going to end up with one raw edge on display, which I'm a little bit annoyed about, this one here, but I don't think it's the end of the world, and I will put some fray check on the bottom of this here, and then I'm just going to amend the seam allowance so that it actually is longer and that it can get felled into the seam, because this bit is going to get turned under, so I will just amend that on the pattern for the next one that I make, because I can see myself making this again. I do like this skirt. So let's get all the flat felling done, then we can move on to the waistband. They are not quite perfect right angle stitching on the top stitching, but that's what I was doing it from the wrong side so that I could make sure that I was catching everything and making sure that everything was neatly done. So that is the inside finished. Now it's time for the waistband.
The waistband was very simple. I pressed it in half, wrong sides together, so I had a nice crease. Once everything had been pressed, I then found the centre and quarter points of the waistband and the skirt, marked them with pins and pinned it together and sewed it together. Then I turned the waistband so that the right sides were together and sewed up the two short edges. I like to have a long tab on one side of my waistband for a hook and bar. It does vary which side that gets put on. Sometimes it's the right side, sometimes it's the left. It doesn't really bother me. I think there's a correct way, but like I say, it really doesn't bother me, so it can end up being either. Once the short ends were sewn, I then pinned everything into place and then top stitched everything together from the right side to secure everything into place and add a little bit of decoration. I liked how it looked, so I added a second layer of top stitching just to again reinforce the waistband and make it look decorative.
I have finished off the waistband with some decorative top stitching, which I really like, and it kind of ties in well with the flat fell seams. I've also put on a skirt hook and eye, so the top of the skirt is completely finished. The next thing that I need to do is hem it. Now, if this was a floatier fabric, I probably would let this hang, because there is 100% bias in the hem of this, but I don't think this is going to drop on the bias. It's a really, really tight weave, and I've tried it on and the hem is level, so I'm going to sew some bias binding that matches this bias binding onto the hem, and then I'm going to top stitch that into place as well, just to tie in with the rest of the top stitching, and then the skirt is done. That is the only bit that I have fluffed up on, so I'm a bit annoyed about that, but you know what, the rest of this has come out really, really well. So I'm going to get the bias binding on, then we can call this done. Yay! After the initial kind of getting my head around the pattern and how it went together and how I was then going to draft it, I genuinely thought this was going to be fairly easy. Make A-line skirt, add side bit on, cut in right place, move over, add centre back seam, done. I think I overcomplicated it for myself by immediately thinking, aha, I know, I just need to make the waistband or the upper portion fit me, and then I'll smoosh it onto the original pattern. It would have been so much easier if I had just tried to, or I would have gone through so fewer iterations and less paper if I had just drafted it from scratch from my block and just, you know, just trusted the process. I am still genuinely amazed that the hem on this thing is level. I had to just eyeball it and draw in that skirt hem and hope for the best. My theory was that the skirt was 31 inches long. I had drafted it that long on purpose. If I needed to level the hem, I could go, my usual skirt lengths are from about 28 inches to 32 inches. So it gave me some wiggle room in there, especially as I tend to hem things with bias binding, which means only like a 1/4 of an inch turn of cloth at the bottom of a skirt like this. It meant that I didn't need to allow loads for a hem allowance because 1/4 of an inch was needed, but it did mean that I had some wiggle room, that I would end up with a skirt that was still going to be a good length for me, even if I had to chop quite considerable amounts off of the bottom. I haven't had to level this thing at all. I am genuinely amazed by that. I have no idea how it worked out. I hope that my waffling and fumbling through the pattern drafting parts at the beginning of this video have given you some indication of how I did it, because there was a generous amount of luck that happened in this skirt. But I do love it. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. Can you see the interesting seam lines in the particular fabric that I've chosen? No, not this time round. It was a inexpensive denim that I got from the Lady McElroy half-price remnant sale at the beginning of this year after Christmas. They did 50% off of their remnants, and their remnants are generous and well priced already, so it was very inexpensive fabric. I didn't even make a calico mock-up for this because the fabric, this denim, was less expensive than the calico that I have in stock at the moment. I'm really lucky that this ended up working for me on the first iteration, but like I say, this was wearable muslin fodder, which is the intended purpose of this kind of fabric, is to fluff around and find out. It's genuinely amazing that this has worked for me, but The downside is that you can't really see the interesting seaming details because this fabric doesn't have a nap or an obvious pattern. I think if I was to do this again, and I 100% will be making this skirt again, I think I will do another corduroy version because I really liked how the nap and the different way that the light hit the nap affected how the panels looked. There were obviously also lines on the corduroy as well, which helped enhance the kind of panels and the wraparound nature of the bottom of the skirt. I definitely think I would do one in corduroy again. I'm also considering some striped denim that I have for the next iteration, and I can 100% see myself putting this skirt onto some of my favourite bodices for a different variation on a fit and flare skirt on some of the dresses that I make, because we all know I love that silhouette, but it is nice to mix the skirts up and try something different every now and again. As I mentioned, I did think this was going to be a much easier project than it turned out to be. The actual cutting out and sewing of this was done in an afternoon. It was the drafting of it that took the most amount of time, and I think it was just one of those things where I'm not used to drafting my own patterns, and so I was second guessing myself, kind of just doubting the process that I should have just trusted and gone through by trying to kind of retrofit to the old pattern, which I know doesn't fit me. Next time, because there are a few interesting skirt patterns that I've seen that I would like to try and recreate, I'm going to try and trust my own instincts and just draft from scratch. Well, I have to, I don't have either of those patterns to kind of refer back to other than those line drawings, but I'm going to just try and draft from scratch and trust the process, and obviously make wearable muslins. Don't just dive in with really expensive fabric. The stripe denim that I'm talking about is really expensive Robert Kaufman railroad denim. I would not have jumped into this pattern with that fabric for the very first iteration. Inexpensive wearable muslin fodder first, then fancy fabrics. So I hope all of that made sense. Hopefully in post-production I have managed to make that all make sense, but if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section down below, and let me know what you think of this second iteration of my Halston skirt. I love it, and there 100% will be more. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.